A sacred clown will, through humor, penetrate a person's ego in order to show them the other side of the coin. And so because of that, it's a very necessary medicine, because the Heyoka Empath is a mirror. Many intuitives and empaths are drawn to the archetype of the sacred clown. So today, I'm going to be explaining the archetype of the rebel, known as the Heyoka Empath. In my video, The Esoteric Meaning of the Trickster, I talk about how there's two polarities to this Heyoka or sacred clown archetype. And so, when we have one polarity, where this trickster archetype of the sacred clown is being expressed in a way that exposes truth and exposes us to our own consciousness, therefore light. And the negative polarity of the trickster would be what we know as archons or watiko, any type of negative forces or negative entities that play upon the mental body in particular. So, when it comes to the Heyoka Empaths, or what we're calling the rebel or sacred clowns, this is specifically what is known as the positive trickster archetype. They're usually known as providing a very important and niche medicine for humanity. And this medicine for humanity is usually a very central point to something that is pointing out others' blind spots because they cannot see the larger scope. They cannot embody a larger, more holistic worldview. The Heyoka Empath got its name from the Native American Lakota shaman. So the Lakota people are probably pissed that the internet took it. But in esoterica, this type of empath is best known as the Fool, the tarot archetype that represents the paradox of endings and beginnings being the same and a matter of perception. Heyoka Empaths are not perfect people themselves. They are still learning and growing and healing like everyone else. But their challenges are very different from other forms of empaths and healers, because they incarnated to be a mirror for how out of touch a person or collective is with their soul. So Heyokas work on the level of the soul. Amusement is the highest level of being. I know that may sound tone deaf or feel horrible thinking of amusement in that way, because when we hear that amusement is the highest level of being, we will naturally think of everything taking place inside the world that is the exact opposite of amusement. But we have to really understand what amusement is, beyond it provoking laughter. And if we can understand what amusement is, then everything else regarding this form of healer will make much more sense. Amusement is the culmination of the entire spectrum of consciousness. So amusement is the information of the lower states of consciousness and the middle states of consciousness and the higher states of consciousness, all interacting with each other and interconnecting or moving through each other. So amusement is the elevation of energy through all the different states of consciousness. And once all those states of consciousness have been felt and experienced and perceived, an amusement arises, much like an unexpected byproduct of some primary process. In this sense, amusement is not the point, it is the byproduct. But do you see why Heyoka Empaths are also known for being rebels who deeply care about injustices and are strong advocates for humanity? It's because of the same exact reason that amusement is their medicine and their dominant resting frequency. Because to have this level of amusement in the way that society and the world and the cosmos is set up, you would also be able to deeply feel for others beyond the boundaries of our egos. So the sacred clown does not have firm boundaries for their feelings. They feel the experience of everyone and everything and even every process. Because of this, you cannot understand the effects of their triggers from a linear perception, because the catalysts are happening at a soul level for the soul of the person, not their ego, and it's being done in a non-linear and nonsensical way. That is the real meaning of the sacred clown. To be a sacred clown is far more than being a comedian in the face of society. It is to be a representative from the cosmos and to mirror to the world wherever they are taking themselves too seriously and cannot move frequency because of it, wherever they are lost in their own facade and have put up walls to their own emotions. and wherever they are stuck in a mental prison of their own limiting thoughts and beliefs. The Heyoka reminds the world that they are human, so feel deeply and to live from your raw expression. But they also remind the world that they are superhuman and limitless, for you are God with amnesia. So the medicine of the sacred clown is to deliver truths through the vessel of humor, because humor can penetrate our ego and the ego's barriers better, and that is why they're empathic. It's because they're using their humor to impart truth to us that will raise our frequency. And so, when it comes to truth and even humor, we're not even just looking at being funny for the sake of being funny. We're not just looking at it from the level of, okay, well, I get to use humor as a passive-aggressive shield in order to just blah on people. Instead, it's very wise and necessary. So a lot of times we can use anything, especially humor, for being very passive-aggressive and then just laughing it off. And that can be one of the most unconscious, wounded aspects to use of humor. It's one of those things where it's weaponized. So the sacred clown is one where it's using humor, but with the sacred clown, instead, it's coming from a very, like almost surgically necessary place. So it's potent, and with potency of truth, of course, that can be taken by the ego in all sorts of ways. And because of that, it can be looked at as however the person who's receiving that medicine chooses to feel about it. And that would be valid as well. But it's still coming from a very potent and surgically necessary place because that's their medicine. It's empathy in that way. So this is what's so important to understand about this archetype, because a lot of stuff is known about it, except really like the nitty-gritty, most important parts of it. It's a necessary and surgically conveyed type of truth through the vessel of humor. And because of that, that's where their compassion, and that's why they're known as empathic. It's because they can feel all of the world. You can feel so much that you're getting so much information about what's going on in the sentience of the world, right? Not just the mental body, in the actual experiences of others. Now, this is what's very important to understand. It's that when we're looking at what is the highest truth, what is the highest act of love, what is that greater good, it's not always gonna look like love and light that's levitating. And this is what's so important to understand, because when you're actually connected to the visceral experience of the world, or what I'm calling the empath, it doesn't normally feel good. And so a lot of what we have to do is learn not how to disconnect, but learn how to establish and cultivate quality of life. Quality of life is so, so important, because we don't want to continue adding to all of the woes of the world by drowning with them. That helps nobody, not at a vibrational level, not at a mental, emotional level. So it really is about learning how to activate our empathicness in a way where we're not drowning by proving how good we are by suffering. That's scarcity consciousness, that's scarcity programming, and that's from the false light. So this whole Heyoka Empath archetype is not meant to just drown in the suffering of the world. Instead, their empathy is used to inform them of where a person has their own challenges, their own blocks to themselves, and then gives a medicine that helps them integrate themselves, integrate their body, mind, spirit, or show them a larger worldview. So if we're only seeing one side of the coin per se, a sacred clown will, through humor, penetrate a person's ego in order to show them the other side of the coin. And so because of that, it's a very necessary medicine. It's humor not used in its shadowy, murky, passive aggressiveness. Instead, it's used in a way where, yeah, it can look really shadowy and passive aggressive if we have a lot of barriers within ourselves. So that's kind of like how the medicine will show up. because the Heyoka Empath is a mirror. They're a mirror of a person's shadow. They help a person meet wherever a person has denial or resistance within themselves. And so because of that, mocking is a medicine at that point. When it's used with that intentional amount of compassion and empathy, an empathy that's one that it's not by choice, it's because we're so in tune with the suffering, but also the sentience of the world. So let's think about what true unconditional love is. If something is truly without conditions, then what it's really doing is saying it can cross boundaries. It's not just in one condition or one boundary of a place. And that's the other aspect that I'm referring to when I'm talking about the sacred clown or the Heyoka Empath. They're the trickster archetype, which is known for crossing boundaries, and also known as being a psychopomp, meaning retrieving from the underworld, traveling between the underworld and the earthly world, or even the higher world and the earthly world, communicating important information. So we could look at this as the subconscious or even the shadow, and relaying information from that realm into the conscious world. And so from the dark to the light, and from the light to the dark. So the Heyoka Empath doesn't have boundaries. They're known as crossing boundaries. You know, they're not just left or right. They're not just up or down. They're the integration point. They are the central point. So they're the axis that holds the higher world and the lower world, or the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. And so because of that, they're able to use sacredness or profaneness. They're known as the sacred and the profane because it doesn't matter to them. They're unconditional. If the Heyoka Empath is the central point of integration, then their medicine is for one to integrate. And that's exactly what they do. They integrate a person's ego with their higher self, or their subconscious or their shadow with their conscious mind. They're an integrative energy. And that's what they are. They are the representative of the central point. And so what this rebel archetype is really doing is bringing us into our wholeness. Their medicine is one not just of integration, it's one for our soul to become whole. Now that's funny because a lot of people think that the soul's already whole. Well, the soul is, according to esoterica, in a lot of different places. So when I'm referring to the soul at this point, it is the part of our soul that we are so out of touch with that we have now just become locked into a paradigm, and we're operating from that egoic mind that's identified with that paradigm. Whatever that paradigm might be, it doesn't matter. This is not pointed at any one direction. This is just talking about, in general, how we get sucked into a paradigm. And when we get sucked into a paradigm, we can become so disconnected from our true self, or so disconnected from our essence or our spirit, that then we just start operating in a way that we can only perceive things in one of its dimensions. So if it's just like a dimension of, oh, everything is all light, or if we're really locked into the darkness or negative feedback loops, whatever it is, whenever we're in an extreme imbalance, it's very typical for us to attract some form of sacred clown in order to mirror to us in a very unconditionally surgical way what that type of love in that case scenario is. So love's not always going to feel good or pleasant. It really depends. Just like how sometimes what we need is to be heard by others, and we just need to be understood by others. So at that point, do you really feel like the best thing to do is just sit there and mock or sit there and try to explain to us something? No, at that point, the medicine would be that we need to be heard. And so the medicine would be at that point really like active listening, or just being very openly present with someone and holding space. But yet, there's so many different types of medicine. So when we look at things only through one lens of medicine, that is even when the ego gets locked into a paradigm. So the sacred clown medicine isn't everywhere and always and all. It's specifically when we're so out of balance, when we're so lost inside an egoic structure or paradigm or programming, and we're not seeing the other side of the spectrum, possibly even more than one side of the spectrum. And whenever we get locked into that, that's when we've lost touch with our own capacity for wholeness. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm specifically saying that the medicine of the sacred clown is to mirror whatever is blocking that person, or mirror a person's inner resistance, not by them doing it the same, but by using comedy and truth as a surgical medicine for unblocking whatever their psychic body or their ego structures have there that are holding them from a larger perception. So that is a potent love. That is a very strong type of medicine. And it's quite courageous at that point, which is why they're known as being rebels. They're known as being rebels because, once again, they're not worried about looking like they're levitating on some cloud when they have to deliver a truth. And that truth doesn't always need to be negative. Sometimes it could be a highly positive truth. It doesn't really matter, because the sacred clown is not concerned with whether it's super negative or positive. It depends on context. Everything depends on the person and the imbalances. So if a person has a block to their own humanness and they have resistance to the human experience, as many of us do, because we have to go to the bathroom, and that's really weird. And I know that everyone else thinks that that's weird too, and we all never got over that. Then that context would be different than another person's medicine in another context, where let's say that block would be one to being more embodied in their higher self, being more elevated consciousness. Because elevated consciousness would be great for the world. It's not some like disembodied, disconnected state, right? It's literally what we're here to do, heal, and through that healing, we become higher consciousness. Somehow higher in this age got turned into like bypassing, and that's a crying shame. So in that case, that medicine would be different. And so wherever the imbalance is, wherever there is a block towards the larger, more integrated, holistic worldview and holistic inner world of the body, mind, spirit, that's where the Heyoka Empaths medicine shines. So they're the rebel because usually their medicine is not going to go over well with others, like at all. And so it's something where it's necessary, but at the same time, it's going to kind of push them in the out circles of what popular thoughts are, whatever those popular circles or those popular thoughts will be, because those are called the norm. And when you're the rebel or the sacred clown, you're specifically challenging the norms, whatever those norms are. And so if you're representing some sort of truth that has yet to be kind of integrated and kind of seen in its holisticness, but you're doing that, that's going to make you a rebel. And so this is why the sacred clown is always linked with being a rebel. They're the rebel because they beat to their own drum, meaning that they're going to do things to the larger, more normalized groups that are going to integrate them, but ultimately piss them off. So when we're thinking about the trickster and the sacred clown, what we're thinking about when I'm talking about how it's a psychopomp, how it crosses boundaries, we're just saying that it has range. And that's what its medicine is as well. It's integration and wholeness because it has range. It has a broad bandwidth. This is a very broad bandwidth. So even though the term empath in this case might sound like, oh, you're really sensitive, it's not the type of sensitive that we normally think of when we're thinking of empath. We're usually thinking, when we think of empath, as somebody like very almost like inward or introverted. And even though the sacred clown is in both worlds and prefers the more inner or introverted world, it's not about that. It's not about how proving or either just ultimately even truly being sensitive. It's more than that. It's about the empathicness being the psychicness. So their psychic abilities, their intuitive abilities are what create that large bandwidth. So it's not just like using that term of a Heyoka empath and then just being offended by everyone and everything and calling yourself sensitive. So I'm just pointing that out because this has become a very popular term. And with all very popular terms, it can get twisted in 3 seconds. And so when it comes to the empathicness specifically for this sacred clown, it's empathic because of the high sentience, the high levels of ability to have empathy for the world through their intuitiveness, whatever that intuitive center is that's strongest in them. But the empathy comes from really being connected to the world and feeling how much pain's in the world, and having now, with that knowledge and information, the data to help specifically tune into the context of one person, not just a blatant medicine for all. One person's blocks and barriers, which will be different from another person's blocks and barriers. So it's the ability with their own empathy to tune in to what specifically is the resistance in one person or group of people versus another. And that's why they're known as the empath. It's because of that ability to tune in and say, what is the medicine here? What is the greater good here? And the greater good is not going to look, like I said, like, oh, I'm just going to be quiet and keep the peace. That is the opposite of the rebel. The opposite of the rebel who bangs their drum, literally beats to their own drum, literally is their own person. The opposite of their version of greater good would be a person who's in the fawn responses version of the greater good, which would be one that's a manipulative version. If a person wants to hold the Heyoka empath hostage in how they should act, then they will try to manipulate what that greater good is. But really, ultimately, what we will come to find, regardless of whether a teacher says this or not, just examine life. And what you will find is that the universe shows us constantly that the greater good doesn't care about our feelings. What it cares about, what it deeply cares about, is our soul. What it deeply cares about is loving us so much into consciousness, and that is what the greater good is. I hope this has helped you come to terms with going to the bathroom, because everyone just got over that, and we were supposed to too, and we still wait every year to be okay with that and have it not be weird. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for higher dimensional guidance through spiritual awakening. See you next time.